Prince William opened Camilla's garage, and what Prince Louis spots inside will leave you speechless. Okay, take a look at this for a moment. William had just ordered the doors to Camilla's private garage opened when palace staff realized the sealed crates inside were not ordinary royal storage. They had been transferred quietly, their records were incomplete, and several of the listed items were connected to belongings once associated with Princess Diana. Then Prince Louis noticed something underneath a dusty covering that nobody else had seen. This is why the discovery mattered. It was not simply an old box hidden behind a vehicle or forgotten by palace staff. According to the accounts surrounding this case, the real problem was that the records suggested Diana's possessions had been moved into Camilla's custody years earlier, under an authorization William had never been shown. And now, standing inside that garage, William was looking directly at something he had believed was gone. The atmosphere changed the moment the garage doors rolled upward. William stepped forward without saying anything. A security officer stood beside him, holding a clipboard filled with inventory numbers. Behind them, several palace staff members remained near the entrance, watching the sealed crates that had triggered the inspection. Camilla stood several feet away, visibly unhappy with what was happening, while Louis remained close enough to his father to see everything. No one had expected the inspection to become personal. The first crate sat against the far wall beneath a grey protective sheet. Another was stacked behind it. A third had been pushed between two older storage cabinets. None carried the kind of clear labeling that should have been present if the transfer had been routine. The security officer checked the numbers again, then looked toward William. Something was wrong. Hi viewers, if you found something connected to your own family hidden away for years, and the people around you had kept you from knowing about it, would you stay quiet or demand the truth? Put your answer in the comments, because that simple choice is exactly where this story becomes uncomfortable. William did not need to raise his voice. His expression had already changed. He looked at the crates, then at the paperwork, then toward Camilla. The question hanging in the garage was no longer whether the boxes could be opened. It was why they had been moved there in the first place. The answer was buried in a line of inventory text. The security officer pointed to a reference number near the bottom of the page. It belonged to a category of royal belongings that had once been held in a secure storage facility. The description was brief, almost painfully ordinary. Personal effects. The words meant little to anyone standing there until the officer compared the number with an older record. Then he stopped. The category had been associated with Princess Diana. For several seconds, nobody moved. William's eyes remained fixed on the page. The garage suddenly felt smaller. What had started as a question about sealed crates had become something else entirely. If the records were accurate, belongings connected to his mother had been transferred from royal storage and placed inside a private garage. And there was something else. The transfer had not happened recently. It had happened years earlier.
Lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother. Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
Camilla reportedly objected when William insisted on continuing the inspection. Her concern, according to the account, was that the matter could be misunderstood and turned into another palace controversy. But William was no longer looking at the situation as an administrative inconvenience. He wanted to know exactly what had been moved, who had authorized it, and why the records had never reached him. The garage remained quiet as staff began checking each crate. One had a faded seal across its lid. Another carried an old royal storage label. The third had no visible marking at all. That third crate bothered William most. It looked as though someone had deliberately removed its original identification. The security officer crouched beside it and ran a gloved hand across the lid. Dust gathered beneath his fingers. There were scratches along one corner, fresh enough to suggest the crate had been moved more recently than the others. William noticed them. He said nothing. Then came another discovery. A palace inventory record from years earlier listed several Diana-related possessions as transferred, but the receiving location had been abbreviated. It did not clearly identify a public archive. It did not identify a museum collection. It pointed toward private royal storage. The same category now appeared beside Camilla's garage records. That was enough to make everyone stop pretending this was routine. William walked deeper into the garage. His shoes sounded against the concrete floor as he passed covered furniture and old equipment. The further he went, the more the place seemed to change. The polished public image of royal life was gone. There were no cameras, no ceremonies, no carefully arranged rooms. Only dust, storage shelves, old containers, and objects that had been left untouched for years.
Displayed woeful incompetence when investigating complaints and concerns about the programme, and were evasive in their reporting to the media and covered up what they knew from their internal investigation.
That was where the strangest part of the story began. Louis was not studying the paperwork. He was looking at the walls. The young prince had been watching the adults argue over numbers and labels, but his attention shifted toward a darker corner behind a line of covered objects. Something about the shape beneath one of the coverings caught his eye. He stepped closer. A small section of fabric had slipped from the side. Underneath was a crest. Louis recognized it. He had seen that crest before, in photographs connected to his family and to his grandmother. He looked toward William. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he called his father over. William turned. Louis pointed toward the covered object. The security officer immediately moved forward, but William raised a hand and stopped him. He wanted to see what his son had noticed. He crossed the garage slowly. Louis remained beside the object, staring at the exposed crest. William crouched slightly and looked beneath the edge of the covering. His expression changed. The crest was unmistakable, but the object beneath it was far more important. William reached down and pulled the dusty covering away. The fabric slid across the floor. Something large and dark appeared underneath. It was an old personal trunk. Not just any trunk. A trunk that palace records had long suggested was missing. William stared at it. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The security officer looked at the inventory sheet again. The royal archivist stepped closer. Camilla remained where she was. And Louis, who had only been looking for something familiar, had unknowingly uncovered the object that could explain why those sealed crates had been moved into the garage at all. William placed his hand on the trunk. The surface was covered in dust, but the edges had been carefully preserved. There were no signs that someone had broken into it. No damaged lock, no forced hinges, nothing that suggested an accidental discovery. It had been stored deliberately. And if the old records were correct, it had been missing for years. William looked toward Camilla. She did not answer the question in his eyes. The silence was becoming more revealing than anything anyone could have said. Then the archivist noticed something else. There was a narrow envelope resting against the inside edge of the trunk. It had been protected from the dust. The paper was aged, but the writing remained visible. One name appeared across the front: William. He stared at it without touching it. Whatever had brought Diana's missing trunk into that garage, the envelope suggested that its final destination may have always been him. But before William could open it, the archivist turned back to the old records and found a detail that made the entire discovery even harder to explain. The trunk had not simply disappeared, it had been transferred. And the authorization carried a royal reference that William had never seen before. If that detail was genuine, then someone had not merely hidden Diana's belongings. Someone had formally moved them. And that meant the next question was no longer what was inside the trunk. It was who had ordered it to be there. So stay with this story, because the next discovery made the trunk itself look like only the beginning, and if you think William should have ignored what he found, ask yourself what you would do before you leave this one unanswered. The trunk was still sitting in Camilla's garage when the palace archivist found the first record that made the room go silent. It was not the trunk itself that caused the problem anymore. It was the paperwork attached to it. A transfer number appeared beside Diana's former belongings, followed by a date and a destination that should not have existed in a private residence. William looked at the document again, then asked for the original archive file. Nobody moved quickly enough for him. The crates around them suddenly mattered more. If one missing possession had somehow survived inside that garage, then the other sealed containers could not be treated as harmless storage. William ordered every crate photographed before anyone touched a lock. Security officers began recording the serial numbers while the archivist compared them against older palace inventories. The process was methodical, but the tension was obvious. The first crate contained old household records, wrapped furniture documents, and several objects with no connection to Diana. The second contained personal effects belonging to members of the wider royal family. Nothing immediately explained why they had been transferred. Then the third crate changed the atmosphere. Its original label had been removed. Only a rectangular patch of cleaner wood remained where the identification plate had once been fixed. Someone had not simply forgotten to label it. Someone had taken the label away. William noticed. The security officer opened the crate after receiving authorization. Inside were empty protective cases, folded archival paper, and several layers of packing material. Whatever had once occupied the space was gone. That raised a new question. Had the crates been moved because someone was hiding Diana's possessions, or had they been moved because someone was trying to conceal what was missing? William asked the archivist to check the original transfer list. The archivist opened an older digital record and then requested the physical file. A few minutes later, a thick folder arrived from the administrative office. Its pages contained decades of inventory changes, handwritten notes, relocation numbers, and signatures. One entry referred to Diana's personal property. Another referred to a transfer involving Camilla's private storage. The two entries were separated by years, but they carried the same reference family. That was enough to make William stop. The implication was difficult to ignore. Somewhere between the original storage facility and Camilla's garage, Diana's missing trunk had been moved through a system that should have created a clear trail. Instead, the trail was broken. The archivist carefully explained that older royal records could contain administrative shorthand and that a reference number alone did not prove who physically moved an object. That distinction mattered. Rumors around royal families often grow from incomplete paperwork, and this record was no exception. But the missing information still needed an explanation. William asked who had authorized the transfer. The archivist searched the file. Nothing. There was a signature reference, but the corresponding authorization page was absent. That was worse than finding a suspicious signature. It meant someone had created a gap in the record. Camilla remained near the entrance while the search continued. She had reportedly objected to William examining the storage area, but she did not attempt to stop the security team once the documents connected the trunk to Diana. Her silence became difficult to read. William did not accuse her. He simply asked the archivist to continue. The search moved deeper into the garage. Old cabinets were opened. Storage shelves were checked. Protective coverings were removed one by one. Several objects were photographed and returned to their positions. Then the security officer found a narrow wooden case behind a row of folded covers. It was smaller than the trunk. Its exterior carried a faded royal inventory sticker. The number matched another Diana-related entry. William looked at the archivist. The case was opened. Inside were several pieces of correspondence, photographs, and a small collection of personal objects. Nothing appeared immediately explosive, but the documents showed that Diana's belongings had been separated into different storage categories after her death. That discovery mattered because the missing trunk had been classified under one of those categories. The implication was clear. Someone had known exactly what they were moving. This was not random clutter. The palace team began photographing every item. Then William asked the question that had been avoided since the inspection began. Why was any of this in Camilla's garage? Nobody gave him a direct answer. The archivist said the records suggested a formal transfer, but the missing authorization page prevented him from confirming the circumstances. Security could confirm where the items had been found. They could not explain why they had arrived there. William looked back toward the trunk. The discovery had already changed the nature of the investigation. It was no longer about finding something lost. It was about understanding why something important had been kept away from the official record. And the deeper the team searched, the less accidental the arrangement appeared. That was when another discrepancy surfaced. The trunk's inventory description did not match its physical condition. The original record described a damaged exterior and a broken clasp. The trunk standing in front of William had neither. Its clasp was intact. Its surface had been preserved. Someone had apparently restored it before placing it into storage. That detail forced the archivist to reconsider the entire timeline. If the trunk had been damaged when it disappeared, then somebody had repaired it afterward. But the repair had never been recorded. William asked for the name of the person responsible. Again, there was no answer. Only another missing entry. The pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. Every time the team reached the point where a name should have appeared, the record stopped. The garage was now surrounded by evidence of movement, storage, repair, and missing documentation. Yet nobody could establish who had made the decisions. Then William noticed something attached beneath the trunk's handle. A thin strip of old paper had been tucked underneath the leather fastening. It was almost invisible. The security officer carefully removed it. There was no long message, only a handwritten storage instruction and a date. The date was years after Diana's death. That meant the trunk had been handled long after it was supposedly lost. William read the note twice. The instruction appeared simple. Keep sealed. Do not transfer without authorization. For the first time, the silence in the garage felt different. Someone had known the trunk was there. Someone had wanted it kept sealed. And someone had apparently understood that moving it required permission. William asked whether the authorization could be located. The archivist said it might be possible. But there was one problem. The original authorization was not in the file. It was missing. The discovery left William facing a choice. He could close the garage, secure the trunk, and allow the palace administration to investigate quietly. Or he could demand answers immediately, knowing that any accusation involving Camilla could explode beyond the walls of the residence. He chose neither. Instead, he ordered the entire storage inventory preserved exactly as found. No object was to be removed. No record was to be altered. No one was to discuss the discovery outside the authorized team. Then he turned toward the trunk again. The envelope bearing his name was still waiting. The seal had never been broken, and whatever Diana had left inside it could now answer a question the missing palace records could not. If you believe William had the right to know why his mother's belongings were hidden from him, do not scroll away now, because the next part gets far worse, and staying silent about what happens next means letting the people behind this unanswered mystery keep their secrets. The envelope remained unopened, but the answer was already beginning to emerge from the paperwork around it. William stood beside the trunk, while the archivist carefully placed the missing authorization reference on the table. The document number was old, but it was not meaningless. It belonged to a restricted category used for sensitive royal property. That meant the transfer had not been handled like ordinary household storage. Someone had deliberately classified it. The archivist checked the date again. Then he checked it against the palace's older inventory system. The dates matched. The transfer had taken place years earlier, long after Diana's death, when the contents of her private estate were already supposed to have been catalogued and secured. Yet the records showed movement after the original cataloguing process. William's attention shifted toward the envelope. He still did not open it. Instead, he asked for the full transfer history. The archivist began tracing the references backward. The first record placed the trunk in a royal storage facility. The next record showed it had been removed from that location. Then came a gap. After that gap, another entry placed the item under private royal storage. The destination was connected to Camilla, but the name of the person who authorized the movement was missing. That omission was becoming the central problem. It would have been easy to accuse someone. It would have been easy to assume the worst. William did neither. He understood that an incomplete record could have several explanations. But there was one fact nobody could explain. The trunk was physically there. The paperwork placed it there. And the authorization that supposedly allowed it to happen was nowhere in the file. The palace archivist requested access to a second archive. This one contained restricted administrative records that were not normally included in routine inventory searches. The request required additional clearance, but William approved it immediately. While the archivist waited, security continued examining the garage. They found nothing dramatic. That was almost more disturbing. There were no signs of forced entry, no damaged locks, no obvious attempt to conceal the trunk after it had been placed there. Everything suggested deliberate storage, careful storage, long-term storage. Whoever placed the trunk there had expected it to remain untouched. That raised another question. Why? William finally reached toward the envelope. His fingers stopped just above the seal. The paper was fragile. The writing on the front appeared to have been preserved carefully. His name was written by hand, and that made the moment more personal than any inventory record could ever be. He looked at the envelope for several seconds. Then he withdrew his hand. The archivist had returned. There was another record. This one contained a reference to the trunk's condition when it was transferred. The description was different again. The item had apparently been wrapped before transportation, not simply placed inside a crate. Wrapped, protected, sealed. That meant someone had taken unusual care to preserve it. The archivist then noticed something that had been overlooked in the earlier search. The transfer record contained a secondary notation. It referred to an instruction that was not attached to the file. William asked what that instruction was. The archivist could only read the surviving description: confidential handling, restricted access, no public cataloging. The room became silent again. Those three instructions changed the meaning of everything. Diana's trunk had not simply been moved into private storage. It had apparently been placed under special restrictions. William looked toward Camilla. She remained quiet. There was still no direct evidence that she had personally ordered the transfer. There was no verified document showing that she had opened the trunk or even handled its contents. But the question had become unavoidable. Why had something belonging to Diana been placed somewhere connected to Camilla under confidential restrictions? William asked whether Camilla had ever been informed of the transfer. The answer was uncertain. The records did not establish it. That distinction mattered. Rumor could fill the gap quickly, but records could not. And William was dealing with records. He ordered the archivist to keep going. The search moved to correspondence, letters between palace departments, administrative memoranda, storage requests, security notifications, anything that might explain the movement. For several minutes, the team found nothing. Then a single memorandum appeared. It was short, too short. It referenced Diana's personal effects and instructed staff to ensure that certain items remained protected from unnecessary access. No reason was given. No explanation was attached. The memorandum had been issued years earlier. William read it once, then again. There was something familiar about the wording. It sounded less like a storage instruction and more like an attempt to prevent someone from asking questions. But that was an interpretation, not proof. The evidence still had to be separated from suspicion. William understood that better than anyone. He asked the archivist to identify the department responsible for issuing the memorandum. The archivist searched the reference. The answer appeared. It was an office that had handled sensitive royal correspondence during the period when the transfer took place. That office no longer existed in the same form. Its records had been reorganized. Its files had been moved. And one section was missing. Again, the trail ended. William stepped away from the table. The garage had become a maze of unanswered questions. But one thing was now certain. The trunk had not vanished by accident. It had moved through an official system. Someone had recorded the movement. Someone had restricted access. And someone had failed to preserve the final authorization. The envelope was still untouched. Then Louis noticed something else. He was standing near the trunk when his attention returned to the leather fastening. There was a tiny mark beneath it, a faded set of initials. The archivist leaned closer. He recognized them. They were connected to the person responsible for overseeing the original transfer. That was the first name they had found. William immediately asked for the person's full file. The archivist hesitated. The record was restricted. William gave permission to retrieve it. As the request was sent, William finally looked down at the envelope again. The seal remained intact. Whatever was inside could not explain who authorized the transfer. But it might explain why the trunk mattered enough to be hidden. And if the message had been written specifically for William, then there was a possibility that Diana herself had anticipated that one day he would find it. That thought changed his expression. This was no longer simply about palace administration. It was about his mother. William carefully lifted the envelope. He turned it over. There was no return address, no official seal. Only his name. And beneath it, in smaller handwriting, was a final instruction. Do not open until you know where it came from. William stopped. The instruction did not explain what was inside. It created another mystery. Someone had expected the envelope to be found. Someone had also expected William to question its origin before reading it. The garage had started with sealed crates. It had uncovered Diana's missing trunk. Now it had produced a message that appeared to warn William not to trust the story surrounding it. And the person who could potentially explain everything was standing only a short distance away. Camilla had not left. She had heard every question. She had watched every document being opened. And she had seen William holding the envelope with her stepfamily's name connected to the transfer records. For the first time, the silence between them seemed impossible to maintain. William turned toward her. Before he could speak, the archivist returned with the restricted personnel file. There was a photograph on the front, a name beneath it, and beside that name was the authorization number William had been searching for. If you want to know whose authority moved Diana's trunk into Camilla's possession and why William was never told, stay with this story. Because the next file does not just make the mystery worse, it points directly toward the person who signed it. The photograph changed everything. William stared at the face printed on the restricted personnel file, while the archivist remained beside him, waiting for a reaction. The name beneath the photograph belonged to a former palace official who had been responsible for sensitive household movements during the exact period when Diana's trunk disappeared from the official inventory. But there was a problem. The official had not been working for Camilla. He had been operating through a separate royal administrative office. That meant the transfer could not simply be dismissed as a private arrangement between Camilla and palace staff. There had been an administrative chain behind it, and somewhere inside that chain, someone had decided Diana's belongings required special treatment. William turned the first page. The file contained routine information at first: dates of service, previous responsibilities, departmental appointments. Nothing immediately connected the official to the trunk. Then he reached the transfer section. One line stopped him. The official had signed an authorization concerning the temporary relocation of sensitive personal effects. The date matched the period when Diana's trunk disappeared from the main storage inventory. William looked at the archivist. Temporary relocation? The archivist nodded. That word created another problem. Temporary meant the trunk should have been returned. There was no return record. William continued reading. The authorization did not mention Camilla by name. Instead, it referred to a private royal residence and instructed staff to keep the items inaccessible except under specific circumstances. The location matched the residence connected to Camilla, but the reason was missing. That missing explanation had become the most important piece of information in the entire investigation. Why had Diana's belongings required restricted storage years after her death? The archivist searched for an accompanying memorandum. Nothing. He checked the correspondence register. Still nothing. Then he checked the outgoing document log. A reference appeared. The document existed, but the file itself was gone. William's expression hardened. Someone had removed a document from an otherwise complete administrative sequence. The question was no longer whether records were incomplete by accident. There were too many gaps, too many missing pages, too many references pointing toward documents that could not be found. William ordered the archivist to continue searching. The team moved to another archive system. This one contained scanned copies of older correspondence. The search took several minutes because the records had been digitized inconsistently. Then, a document appeared. It was a brief internal message. The message referred to Diana's personal effects and instructed staff to keep certain items away from general household access. Again, there was no explanation. But there was a second reference number. The same number appeared beside the trunk's transfer authorization. William leaned closer to the screen. The two records were connected. The transfer had not been a random administrative decision. It had followed an instruction. But who had issued that instruction? The name was not visible. Only an abbreviated office code appeared. The archivist recognized it. That office had handled confidential matters for senior members of the royal household. William asked whether Camilla could have requested the transfer. The archivist could not confirm that. There was no document proving it. That distinction remained important. The evidence showed where the trunk had gone. It showed that someone authorized restricted handling. It showed that the destination was connected to Camilla. It did not prove that Camilla herself had ordered the move. Still, William could not ignore the timing. The transfer occurred during a period when Diana's belongings were already under intense administrative scrutiny. The trunk was removed. The record disappeared. Years passed. Then the trunk appeared in Camilla's private garage. William looked toward the envelope again. His mother's handwriting was still visible across the front. He had spent years accepting that some pieces of Diana's private life were simply gone. Now one of them was sitting in front of him, and someone had known where it was. The archivist then discovered another entry. This one was not about the trunk. It concerned a group of personal items that had been stored alongside it. Several were marked as transferred. One was marked as unresolved. Another had no final destination. William asked for the item descriptions. The archivist read them carefully. Photographs, personal correspondence, a leather case, a collection of private papers. William's attention sharpened. The trunk might not have been the only thing removed from the official archive. The missing items could have been separated years earlier. That possibility changed the investigation completely. The garage might contain only one surviving part of a much larger collection. William ordered a full comparison between the original Diana inventory and the current Royal Archive. The process would take time, but the first results were already troubling. Several items listed decades earlier could no longer be located. The archivist could not say where they had gone. There were no confirmed transfers, no disposal records, no public collection references, just missing entries. William stood quietly as the information was read out. He was no longer looking at Camilla. He was looking at the entire system that had allowed the gaps to remain unnoticed. Then the archivist opened the personnel file again. The photograph on the front belonged to the official who had signed the transfer. The official was no longer alive. That meant William could not simply summon him and demand an explanation. Whatever he knew had disappeared with him. But the file contained one final detail. A handwritten note had been added beside the authorization number. It had been written by another official years later. The note contained only a few words. Instruction came from above. William read it twice. The archivist could not identify who above referred to. It could have meant a senior administrator. It could have meant a senior royal household. It could have referred to someone else entirely. The phrase was too vague to prove anything, but it explained why the missing authorization mattered. Someone had given the order. The person who signed the paperwork may not have been the person who wanted the transfer. William finally asked for the envelope to be secured. He still refused to open it. Before that happened, he wanted the chain of custody established. He wanted to know whether the letter had been placed inside the trunk before it disappeared from the archive or afterward. That question could determine everything. The archivist examined the envelope carefully. The paper showed signs of age. The seal appeared untouched. The handwriting appeared consistent with other surviving examples attributed to Diana. But without specialist examination, nobody could make an absolute determination. William ordered the envelope preserved exactly as it was. No one would open it yet. Then came the moment that unsettled him most. The archivist returned to the original inventory. One item had been marked with a handwritten symbol. The symbol appeared beside the trunk's original entry. The archivist recognized it as a notation used for material that required personal authorization before release. But beside the symbol was another handwritten word: William. The room went quiet. If the notation was genuine, then someone had identified William as the intended recipient long before the trunk was discovered in Camilla's garage. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. The trunk may never have been intended to disappear permanently. It may have been kept somewhere until William was supposed to receive it. But if that was true, why had nobody told him? And why had the trunk ended up inside Camilla's private garage? William looked at the envelope again. For years, he had been told through the normal machinery of royal life that missing things were simply missing. Now he had proof that at least one missing possession had been sitting behind a locked garage door. The evidence was no longer abstract. He could touch it, he could see it, and he could trace part of its history. But the most important section of that history remained hidden. The authorization that sent the trunk into private storage was still missing. The person who gave the instruction remained unidentified, and the envelope bearing William's name was still sealed. Then the archivist noticed something beneath the envelope. A second piece of paper had been folded into the lining of the trunk. William watched as it was carefully removed. There were only 2 lines written on it. The first was a date. The second was a warning. Ask who moved it before you ask why. William looked up. For the first time since entering the garage, he appeared genuinely unsettled. because the warning suggested that whoever had prepared the trunk expected the truth to be more complicated than anyone in that room had imagined. And if that warning was meant for William, then the next question was terrifyingly simple. Who moved Diana's trunk? If you have stayed this long, do not look away now, because the next discovery brings that missing name closer than anyone expected, and ignoring it would mean allowing the same unanswered question to disappear all over again. The envelope finally opened at 6:17 that evening, and the first line William saw was not a secret about Camilla. It was a message from Diana that made him stop reading. The room had been cleared. Only William, the archivist, and one senior aide remained. The trunk sat open on the table, its contents documented in sealed evidence bags arranged nearby. William had spent hours tracing the missing transfer, yet the answer he wanted was still absent. Who had moved the trunk? Why had it been placed in private storage? And why had nobody told him? He broke the seal. The letter was personal, direct, and unmistakably written for him. Diana spoke about protecting certain belongings until the right moment. She did not accuse Camilla. She did not name a conspiracy. Instead, she explained that some family possessions could become sources of conflict if released without care. Then William reached the final paragraph. Diana had written that one day he might find an item that appeared to have been lost. If that happened, he should not judge the person holding it before discovering who had instructed them to keep it safe. William read that sentence twice. It changed the meaning of the garage. The account surrounding the discovery had made Camilla's involvement look suspicious because the trunk had been found in her private storage. But Diana's own message introduced another possibility. Camilla may not have been the person who ordered the trunk hidden. She may have been the person entrusted with something she did not fully understand. William asked for the transfer authorization again. The archivist placed the document beside the letter. There it was. The signature belonged to the former official already identified in the restricted file. But beneath the signature was a second notation that had previously been overlooked because it had been written in faint pencil. By instruction of the household. That phrase was dangerously vague. It did not identify a person. It did not prove Camilla had ordered anything. It did not prove Charles had done so. It only confirmed that the official had acted on instructions from someone senior. William demanded the supporting correspondence. This time, the archivist found it. A short memorandum explained that the trunk had been moved because its contents were considered deeply personal and should remain protected from unnecessary exposure. The destination had been selected because it was secure, private, and accessible to the household. Camilla's residence had been used as storage. That was the missing context. The discovery did not erase the secrecy. It made the secrecy more complicated. William now understood why Camilla had resisted the inspection. She had apparently known that the garage contained sensitive family property, but the available records did not establish whether she knew the full history of the trunk. That distinction mattered. So William called her into the room. Camilla entered quietly. For several seconds, neither spoke. William placed Diana's letter on the table. Camilla looked at it. Her expression changed. According to the account, she admitted that she had been aware of a sealed trunk being stored among private household effects years earlier. She said she had been told it was not to be opened and that the arrangement came through palace administration. But she claimed she had never been told that the trunk belonged specifically to Diana. William listened without interrupting. Then he asked the question that had been hanging over the entire investigation. Why had she never told him? Camilla's answer was simple. She had believed the matter was being handled through official channels. That answer did not satisfy William. It explained her silence, but it did not explain the missing records. The investigation continued. The palace archivist compared the old inventory with the current collection. Several items connected to Diana were accounted for. Others remained unresolved. Some had been transferred into museums or private family collections. A small number still had incomplete histories. The trunk was no longer considered missing. It was formally returned to the Royal Archive under William's authority. But the story did not end there. One final ledger was discovered during the comparison. It contained a list of items moved under the same restricted category as Diana's trunk. Most had clear destinations. One did not. The entry described another personal container. Its contents were not listed. Its location was blank. Its transfer date was the same period as the trunk. William looked at the archivist. "Is it missing?" The archivist checked the system. There was no confirmed location. That meant the trunk found in Camilla's garage might not have been the last piece of Diana's private collection that had disappeared from the official record. There could be another. And this time, there was no dusty garage to provide an answer. The palace faced a decision: reveal every uncertainty and invite a new wave of scrutiny, or continue the quiet investigation until the remaining records could be verified. William chose the investigation. He ordered the unresolved inventory reviewed from the beginning. No assumptions, no protected names, no exceptions. The instruction was significant because it removed the issue from the category of family disagreement and placed it inside formal archival review. The trunk itself was transferred under controlled conditions. The envelope was preserved. The letter was catalogued. The authorization was copied. The missing instruction was flagged for further examination. And Camilla's name remained attached to the history of the storage location, but not as proof of wrongdoing. That distinction should not be ignored. Royal stories often grow around incomplete information. A hidden room becomes a scandal. A missing document becomes a conspiracy. A family disagreement becomes an accusation. In this case, the strongest mystery was not proof that someone had stolen Diana's belongings. It was the unexplained chain of decisions that allowed those belongings to disappear from ordinary view for years. For William, the emotional weight was different. He had not simply recovered an old trunk. He had recovered something connected to his mother. The object had survived years of storage, changing households, incomplete records, and silence. Louis had been the person who noticed the crest. That innocent observation had forced adults to confront something they might otherwise have left untouched. William later secured the trunk among Diana's documented personal effects. But the final ledger remained open. One unidentified container, one unresolved location, one missing piece of the same historical trail. And somewhere in the palace records was the possibility that the answer had been sitting there all along. That unanswered entry now sits at the center of everything still unknown. The question now was no longer whether William had found Diana's missing trunk. He had. The question was, what else remained hidden? Because if one item could disappear from the official record, move through restricted storage, and eventually turn up inside Camilla's private garage, then the palace had to ask a much harder question. What happened to everything else that was never found? That question may be more important than the trunk itself. And it is exactly why this story should not end with William closing the lid. If you believe forgotten royal records should be examined, instead of buried behind silence, then make your voice count. Like this video, share it with someone who follows these stories, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Doing nothing means letting unanswered questions disappear again. But staying with this channel means being here when the next royal mystery gets even worse and far more interesting.